The town of Gritstone was a place where kindness went to die. Its lifeblood was dust, a fine, ochre powder that gritted in the teeth, settled in the lungs, and crusted over every open wound, physical or otherwise. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the splintered planks of the saloon, the faded letters of the general store, and the grim, skeletal frame of the gallows that stood like a monument to the town's character in the center of the square. Men in Gritstone learned early to narrow their vision, to look past the suffering in the periphery. It was a survival instinct, a hardening of the soul that was as necessary as the calloused skin on their hands. Rowan Cole had never mastered the art of looking away. It was a failing that had cost him dearly in the war and continued to plague him in the years since. As his weary horse, Boulder, clopped down the single, sorry excuse for a main street that morning, Rowan's only intention was to offload the half-dozen cattle he'd driven for 2 days, collect his pay, and be well clear of Gritstone before the bruised purple storm clouds gathering on the horizon fulfilled their promise. He was a man who preferred the company of wind and sky to the suffocating press of humanity. But fate, as it often did, had laid a snare in his path. A knot of leering, jeering men had gathered near the gallows, their laughter as coarse as burlap. It wasn't a formal hanging. There was no preacher mumbling last rites, no solemnity, just a cruel, public spectacle. Hung by their ankles from the crossbeam, their bodies swaying with a sickening, pendulum-like rhythm, were 3 young Chinese girls. They couldn't have been older than 17. Their simple cotton trousers and tunics were torn and filthy, their long, black hair, usually bound in neat braids, was a tangled mess of dirt and dried blood that swept the ground with every slow swing. Dust swirled in tiny funnels beneath their bare feet. Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose badge was the only clean thing on his sweat-stained shirt, was at the center of the merriment. He held a bottle of whiskey, passing it among his cronies as they made bets on which girl would faint first. A little joke, he bellowed, his voice thick with liquor and malice. Teach these railroad rats a lesson about whose town this is. A cold, familiar sickness churned in Rowan's gut. He'd seen this brand of casual cruelty before, in the smoldering ruins of farmhouses and the vacant eyes of war orphans. It was the arrogance of men who held power and mistook it for righteousness. He was about to spur Boulder onward, to force himself to look away just this once, when a glint of sunlight caught something on the shoulder of the oldest girl. Her head was lolling, her face a mask of bruises and exhaustion, but as her body twisted, the torn fabric of her tunic slipped. There, seared into her skin, was a mark. It wasn't a crude ranch brand but a delicate, intricate symbol, a single, stylized dragon scale, shimmering with the silvered patina of an old scar. The breath caught in Rowan's throat. His world narrowed to that single, impossible mark. He reached up, his fingers tracing the rough, raised lines of an identical scar on his own forearm, hidden beneath the sleeve of his duster. The memory, buried for a decade under layers of dust and blood, rushed back with the force of a flash flood. He was no longer in Gritstone. He was broken and bleeding at the bottom of a ravine, a victim of a rockslide during his short, disastrous stint working a rail line, left for dead by his fellow workers. He remembered the fever dreams, the searing pain, the conviction that he would die there, food for coyotes. And then, a face. An old Chinese man with eyes as deep and knowing as a well, his hands gentle as he cleaned Rowan's wounds with strange-smelling herbs. He remembered the man's daughter, a small, solemn girl with the same fierce eyes as the one hanging before him now. She had brought him water in a chipped clay bowl, her small hand steady. Before they sent him on his way, healed and humbled, the old man had taken a heated metal tool, shaped with the precision of a craftsman. He'd pressed it to Rowan's arm, and then to his daughter's shoulder. Long de Lin, the old man had said, his voice a low rumble. Dragon scale. A mark of our house. It protects those who show kindness and strength. You have both. May it keep you. Now, the girl who had shared that mark, who had helped save his life, hung upside down, her spirit draining into the Gritstone dust. The dam of Rowan's carefully constructed apathy broke. A roar, raw and primal, tore from his chest before he could even form the words in his mind. Stop. The silence that followed was absolute, thick and heavy. The laughter died in the men's throats. Heads turned. Sheriff Brody squinted, his piggy eyes focusing on the lone rider who had dared to interrupt his fun. "I'll buy them." The words hung in the oppressive heat. Brody blinked, a slow, confused motion. "You'll what?" Rowan swung a leg over his saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He unbuckled his rifle from its scabbard and let it drop into the dust, a clear sign he wasn't looking for a gunfight. "Not yet." He walked forward, his hand going not to his pistol, but to the worn leather purse at his belt. "You heard me, Sheriff," Rowan said, his voice level now, cold as a mountain spring. "Name your price. Whatever fine you claim they owe, whatever amusement tax you've levied for this little party. I'll pay it." A few of the men in the crowd snickered, the tension breaking into amusement. A rancher, a stranger, trying to buy railroad trash? It was the best joke they'd heard all day. Brody swaggered forward, his belly preceding him. "This ain't a damned auction, mister. These three were caught stealing food from the general store. They're my property until I say otherwise. They ain't for sale." He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to Rowan's boot. Rowan's gaze didn't waver. His hand, which had been on his purse, dropped slowly, deliberately, until it hovered just over the worn bone handle of his Colt revolver. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, "everything's for sale in Gritstone. We both know that. The only question is the price." The sheriff's smug expression faltered. He looked at Rowan's eyes and saw something there that wasn't on the menu for his day's entertainment, a cold, hard resolve that promised consequences far more severe than a hangover. He glanced at Rowan's gun, then back at his face. He saw a man who had made a decision, a man for whom this was not a whim, but a reckoning. Brody's bluster deflated, replaced by a greedy gleam. He licked his lips. $100, Brody said, the number outrageous, designed to make Rowan balk. In coin. For the trouble they caused. The crowd murmured. It was a fortune, more than enough to buy a dozen prime cattle. Rowan didn't even blink. He unfastened his purse, opened it, and poured a cascade of gold and silver coins into his palm. He counted it out with methodical precision, the clinking of the metal the only sound in the square. He walked up to Brody and dropped the heavy pile into the sheriff's sweaty, outstretched hand. Now cut them down. That night, the promised storm broke with biblical fury. Lightning clawed at the sky, momentarily illuminating the vast, empty prairie in stark white and black. Rain fell in solid, driving sheets, turning the dusty tracks into a muddy quagmire. Inside the covered wagon, jolting and swaying away from the hateful lights of Gritstone, the three girls sat huddled together, wrapped in Rowan's old wool coat. They trembled, from cold, from shock, from the terror that had been their world for days. The oldest, the one with the dragon scale, sat apart from her sisters. Her name was Mai. She stared out at the deluge, her face a stoic mask, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her sisters, Leanne, Annan, clung to each other, their fear a palpable thing in the cramped space. Rowan didn't speak for miles. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the roar of the thunder were the only sounds. What words could a man possibly find to bridge the chasm between what had happened and where they were now? How did you explain to someone that you had just bought them like livestock, even if it was to save their lives? How did you begin to repay a debt to a ghost, a debt that had just been called in by the man's daughter? Finally, as the storm's fury began to subside into a steady, drumming rain, he cleared his throat. The sound was rough, alien. "You saved my life once," he said, his voice quiet, directed at Mai. "I don't reckon you remember. It was a long time ago." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, she turned her head, and in the dim lantern light, he saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a weariness that went far beyond her years. They were her father's eyes. "My father was Chen," she said, her English heavily accented but clear. "He was a healer and the headman for his crew. You were the white man, the Guelo, they found in the canyon, broken from the rockfall. Rowan nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Your people found me. Nurse me back. I was a different man then. Angry. Lost. Your father, he showed me a kindness I didn't think existed. When I heard he had died in a tunnel collapse a year later, I never got the chance to say thank you. Mai said nothing. She simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering, as if she were trying to peel back the layers of time and dust to see the man her father had seen. Was he still there? Or was this just another kind of trap, another white man making promises he had no intention of keeping? When they finally reached his ranch hours later, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray line on the eastern horizon. The girls climbed stiffly from the wagon and looked around. What they saw was an endless expanse of wide, empty land, rolling away into the darkness. There was a small, sturdy cabin, a barn, and miles of fences stretching out like stitches holding the world together. There was nothing else. No neighbors. No town. Just the wind and the sky and the immense, intimidating silence. You're safe here, Rowan said, his voice low, almost awkward. He gestured toward the cabin. It ain't much, but it's honest. No one will bother you. Mai's reply was a whisper, carried on the damp air, sharp as a shard of glass. Safe? For us? In this land, it is never safe. She was right. The proof came the very next day. Just as the afternoon sun began its descent, a smudge of dust appeared on the horizon, growing steadily into a plume. It didn't take a tracker to know who it was. Sheriff Brody and a posse of his men from Gritstone were coming. He hadn't been satisfied with the money, the humiliation of being faced down by a lone rancher had festered. He wanted his property back, and he wanted to make an example of the man who had defied him. By the time the riders were a mile out, Rowan had loaded his Winchester and saddled Boulder, ready to lead them on a chase if he had to. He turned to the girls, who were watching the approaching dust cloud from the cabin doorway, their faces pale but resolute. Get what you can carry, he said urgently. There's a dry creek bed to the north. You can follow it into the hills. I'll hold them off, buy you time. But the girls didn't move. Mai stepped forward, her chin lifted in defiance. In her hand, she gripped a small, wickedly sharp hunting knife, a tool her father had given her, which she had managed to keep hidden through her entire ordeal. We will not run, she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. We have been running our whole lives. From famine in our homeland, from cruelty on the ships, from hatred in this country. No more. Leanne and Ann stepped up beside her, their fear replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. Our blood is not for sale again, Mai declared, her eyes blazing. Rowan looked at the fire in her eyes, at the unbreakable unity of the three sisters, and he felt something he hadn't felt since before the war, something he thought had been permanently scoured from his soul. He felt hope. When the riders came, a dozen of them, kicking up dust and fury, they found Rowan Cole standing alone at the gate to his ranch, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. That's far enough, Brody, Rowan called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. The sheriff pulled his horse to a halt, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He spat into the dirt. Cole. I knew you were a fool, but I didn't figure you for a thief. Those girls are coming back with me. They belong to the railroad company as indentured laborers. You're interfering with property. They're people, Rowan stated simply. And they're under my protection. You can't protect what ain't yours, Brody sneered, his hand moving toward his pistol. Rowan cocked his rifle, the sound a sharp, definitive click in the silence. You'd be surprised what a man can do when he's got nothing left to lose but his soul. The first shot cracked the air, not from Rowan, but from one of Brody's nervous deputies. The world exploded into a chaos of noise and smoke. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the top rail of the fence near Rowan's head. He fired back, a measured shot that sent one of the riders tumbling from his saddle with a cry of pain. As the gunfight erupted, the girls sprang into action. They were not soldiers, but they were survivors. They darted through the tall prairie grass, their small frames making them difficult targets. They used the rolling land and the storm clouds that still lingered overhead for cover, moving with a fluid grace that belied their ordeal. The youngest, Anne, cried out as a stray bullet grazed her leg, but Mai and Lian were there in an instant, dragging her behind the relative safety of a stone-lined well. Rowan fought like a man possessed, a cornered animal defending its territory. He made every shot count, driving the riders back, forcing them to take cover. When his Winchester was empty, he drew his Colt and retreated behind the sturdy fence posts, the wood exploding around him as bullets found their mark. A slug tore through his left shoulder, a white-hot poker of pain that spun him around and sent him crashing to the ground. His pistol fell from his numb fingers. Brody saw his chance. "He's down," he roared. "Get the girls." Two of his men spurred their horses forward, charging toward the well. But then, through the swirling gunsmoke, a figure emerged. It was Mai. She held no gun, no weapon of war. In her hands was the hangman's rope she had taken from the gallows in Gritstone, a grim souvenir of her torment. She swung it over her head like a lariat, a weighted, deadly whip. As the first rider galloped past, she lashed out. The heavy, knotted end caught the man square in the face, knocking him clean from his saddle. She stood there, small and defiant against the vast landscape, the rope coiled in her hand. "We are not slaves," she cried out, her voice a clarion call that echoed across the fields, imbued with all the pain and pride of her people. "We are the daughters of Chen. We are not property." Her cry, and the shocking, primal image of her wielding the very instrument of her torture as a weapon, gave the riders pause. The thunder, which had been a distant rumble, rolled directly overhead, a deep, celestial growl of agreement. The men looked at each other, at the wounded rancher struggling to rise, at the fierce girl with the rope, at the darkening sky. This wasn't the easy sport they had signed up for. One by one, their certainty wavered. They turned their horses and, without another word, rode back into the gathering gloom, leaving Sheriff Brody alone and exposed. He stared for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, before cursing and wheeling his horse around to follow his men in their ignominious retreat. When the sun rose the next morning, the world was washed clean. Gritstone was quiet. The story of the failed posse would spread, and Sheriff Brody's authority would be forever diminished. The law might come eventually, sniffing around, but out here, on the edge of civilization, the land itself had the final say. And the land had changed. Rowan lay on the porch of his cabin, his shoulder cleaned and crudely bandaged by Mai's surprisingly skillful hands. Inside, by the warmth of the hearth, Lian and Anne were finally asleep, their faces peaceful for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Mai sat in a chair beside Rowan, silent, watching the sky blaze to life. Rowan winced as he shifted his weight, the pain in his shoulder a dull, throbbing reminder of the price of his stand. He looked at her, at the proud set of her jaw, and at the dragon scale mark, now visible on her shoulder. "Did you ever wonder," he asked, his voice raspy, "why your father spared me? A stranger. A Guelo." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She didn't look at him, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. He didn't see a white man or a stranger. He saw a man whose spirit was broken. He told me that there are two kinds of broken men. Those who become cruel, to make others feel their own pain. And those who, having known suffering, refuse to let it happen to others. She turned to him then, her gaze direct and searching. He saw in you what so few saw in him. A man who still remembered mercy. Rowan nodded slowly, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. I reckon he was right." Mai stood, the golden morning light catching in her hair, painting her face in hues of hope and resilience. "We will stay," she said, not a question, but a statement. "My sisters and I. We will work this land with you. It is good land." She paused, looking out over the vast, empty plains that no longer seemed intimidating, but full of promise. "Maybe, in time, it can forgive us both." Rowan felt the corners of his mouth lift in a genuine smile, the first in years. His eyes felt heavy, not with weariness, but with a profound and unexpected peace. "I think," he said softly, it already has. And so it was that a lone, broken rancher brought back 3 lives from the brink of oblivion, and in doing so, found the shattered piece of his own soul he thought he had buried forever in the dust of a forgotten war. For sometimes, mercy costs everything a man has. But in return, it gives back something more valuable than gold, something that can mend a spirit, build a home, and make the desert bloom.